I canceled my daughter's wedding because no one else would. My daughter Lily spent 6 months planning her dream wedding to a man named Ethan, who worked as a financial analyst downtown. She picked out ivory invitations with gold lettering, booked a historic mansion for the reception, and found the perfect dress at a boutique 3 towns over that cost more than my first car. I watched her transform our dining room into wedding planning headquarters with color swatches and seating charts covering every surface, her face glowing with happiness every time she talked about the ceremony. She'd come over for dinner twice a week and spend hours describing the flower arrangements and the 7-tier cake and the string quartet she'd hired to play during the cocktail hour. My husband Richard would nod along and ask questions about the guest list, while I sat there feeling my chest tighten with dread I couldn't explain to anyone. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in late September at a vineyard an hour outside the city, and Lily had 200 guests confirmed with responses still coming in daily. She'd chosen her bridesmaids carefully, 5 of her closest friends from college who'd been with her through everything, and they'd already had their dresses fitted 3 times to get them absolutely perfect. The invitations went out in early July with elegant calligraphy addressing each envelope, and Lily tracked every single RSVP in a spreadsheet she updated religiously. She called me one afternoon practically vibrating with excitement because Ethan's family had finally confirmed they were all coming, including his grandmother who rarely traveled anymore due to her health. I listened to her talk about how perfect everything was going to be while I stared at the invitation magneted to my refrigerator, that expensive cardstock with Lily's name printed next to Ethan's like they were a real couple with a real future. My sister Beverly had called me the week before asking what she should wear and whether she needed to bring a gift to the bridal shower Lily's friends were throwing. I'd made some excuse about checking with Lily and gotten off the phone as quickly as possible because the thought of that shower made me physically ill. Richard found me crying in the bathroom that night and asked what was wrong, but how could I explain that watching our daughter plan a wedding to someone who didn't exist was destroying me from the inside out? He tried to comfort me by saying all mothers got emotional before their daughters' weddings, that it was normal to feel like you were losing your baby girl even though she was just starting a new chapter. The bridal shower happened on a Sunday afternoon at Lily's best friend Madison's house, a beautiful event with mimosas and finger sandwiches and games that made everyone laugh. I sat in the corner watching Lily open presents, kitchen gadgets and linens and picture frames for the home she'd be making with Ethan, and I had to excuse myself twice to cry in the bathroom. Madison's mother found me the second time and rubbed my back, telling me she understood how hard it was to see your daughter grow up and move on with her life. She said her own daughter's wedding had been the same way, that mixture of joy and grief that comes with major life transitions. I thanked her and went back out to watch Lily model a ridiculous toilet paper wedding dress someone had made during one of the games, her face flushed with happiness and champagne. After the shower ended, I helped load all the gifts into Lily's car and she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, thanking me for being the best mom in the world and saying she couldn't wait for me to walk her down the aisle. Richard had passed away from a heart attack 3 years ago, so that honor fell to me instead of a father giving away his daughter, and Lily said it meant even more having me do it because I'd always been her rock. The final dress fitting was scheduled for a Wednesday in late August, and all the bridesmaids gathered at the boutique to see Lily in her completed gown. She emerged from the dressing room looking absolutely radiant in white silk with delicate lace sleeves, spinning slowly so everyone could admire the train that pooled on the floor behind her. The seamstress made a few final adjustments while Lily talked about how Ethan was going to cry when he saw her coming down the aisle, how she couldn't wait to see his face during their first dance. Madison took dozens of photos and posted them to social media with captions about how beautiful the bride looked, and within hours the post had hundreds of likes and comments from people congratulating Lily on her upcoming marriage. I stood in the back of the boutique feeling like I was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me, where I was the only person who understood we were all participating in something fundamentally wrong. The seamstress asked me if I was all right because I'd gone pale, and I blamed it on the heat and the tight fitting room, anything to avoid explaining the real reason I felt like I was suffocating. 3 weeks before the wedding, Lily called me in a panic because the caterer had messed up her order and switched her vegetarian option from pasta primavera to some kind of quinoa dish she'd never approved. I listened to her stress about menu details for 40 minutes, offering suggestions and reassurance while my mind screamed that none of this mattered because there wasn't going to be a wedding. She'd been living in her own apartment downtown for the past 4 years, a cute 1-bedroom place she'd decorated with plants and artwork and photos of her and Ethan that she'd carefully arranged on every surface. I'd visited a few times and seen those pictures, Lily smiling next to empty space where she'd positioned the camera to make it look like someone was standing beside her. Richard had been the one to first notice something was off about 2 years ago, when Lily brought Ethan to Sunday dinner, and spent the entire meal talking to an empty chair. He'd pulled me aside afterward and suggested gently that maybe Lily was struggling more than we realized, that we should encourage her to talk to someone professional about whatever she was going through. But I'd been in denial then, convincing myself that Lily was just lonely and coping in her own way, that she'd eventually meet someone real and this strange phase would pass. After Richard died, Lily's relationship with Ethan had intensified dramatically. She'd call me daily with updates about their life together, how supportive he was being during her grief, how he'd helped her process losing her father. She said Ethan understood loss because his own mother had passed away when he was young, and they'd bonded over their shared experience of navigating life without a parent. The details she provided were so specific and consistent that I started to wonder if maybe I'd been wrong, if maybe there was a real person named Ethan who just happened to be camera shy or busy whenever I tried to meet him. But then Lily's neighbor, a woman named Grace who lived in the apartment next door, had called me 6 months ago sounding concerned. She said she'd heard Lily having full conversations with someone in her apartment multiple times a week, long discussions about wedding plans and future children and buying a house together. Grace had knocked on the door during one of these conversations to borrow sugar and found Lily alone, sitting on her couch talking animatedly to the empty cushion beside her. When Grace asked if her boyfriend had left, Lily had looked confused and said no. Ethan was right there. Couldn't Grace see him sitting next to her? I'd driven to Lily's apartment that same day and let myself in with the spare key she'd given me for emergencies. The place was exactly as I remembered, except for one significant change. Every surface now held framed photos of Lily with empty space beside her. Some were clearly photoshopped with a strange blur where a person should have been. Others were just Lily alone, positioned as if someone was holding her or standing next to her. I found a stack of love letters in her bedroom, dozens of pages written in Lily's handwriting but signed with Ethan's name, each one expressing devotion and commitment and plans for their future together. In her closet hung men's clothes in various sizes, dress shirts and slacks, and even a suit for the wedding, all with tags still attached because no one had ever worn them. I'd sat on her bed holding those letters and feeling my heart break completely, understanding that my daughter had created an entire relationship out of loneliness and grief, and something deeper that I couldn't name. When Lily came home from work that evening, I tried to talk to her gently about what I'd found, suggesting maybe we could see a therapist together to work through some things. She'd gotten defensive immediately, accusing me of invading her privacy and not respecting her relationship with Ethan just because I hadn't spent much time with him. The conversation had ended badly with Lily asking me to leave and saying she needed space from my negativity before the wedding. We didn't speak for 2 weeks after that, the longest we'd ever gone without talking, and when she finally called to apologize, she said she understood I was having trouble adjusting to her getting married, but she needed me to be supportive. I'd agreed to everything she asked because losing her completely felt worse than participating in this elaborate fantasy she'd constructed. My own therapist, Dr. Raymond, had suggested I was enabling Lily's delusion by going along with the wedding plans, that the kindest thing I could do was force her to confront reality even if it hurt. But he didn't understand how fragile Lily had become in the years since Richard's death, how I'd watched her slowly retreat into this made-up relationship as a way of coping with overwhelming loneliness. She'd been in therapy before, right after Richard died, but stopped going after 3 months because she said the therapist didn't understand her. I'd tried to convince her to try a different therapist, but she'd insisted she was fine, that she had Ethan now and he helped her process everything better than any professional could. 2 weeks before the wedding, Lily asked me to come with her to finalize details with the venue coordinator. We drove to the vineyard on a beautiful August morning and walked through where the ceremony would take place, rows of white chairs facing an arbor decorated with climbing roses. The coordinator, a cheerful woman named Vanessa, showed us the reception hall set up with round tables and elegant centerpieces, explaining the timeline for the evening and when different courses would be served. Lily kept referencing what Ethan wanted, how he'd specifically requested the salmon option, and preferred the band to play certain songs during dinner. Vanessa took notes diligently, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, professional courtesy mixed with something that might have been concern. When Lily excused herself to use the restroom, Vanessa leaned closer and asked quietly if everything was all right with the bride, if there was anything she should know about the groom's absence from all the planning meetings. I'd frozen, unsure how to respond, and mumbled something about Ethan being busy with work. Vanessa had nodded slowly and said she'd once coordinated a wedding where the bride had a breakdown at the altar because she'd been in denial about her relationship ending, and she just wanted to make sure nothing similar was going to happen here. The question haunted me for days afterward because I knew exactly what was going to happen at that altar. Lily would stand there in her beautiful dress waiting for a groom who didn't exist, and 200 guests would witness her complete psychological break in real time. I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't allow my daughter to be humiliated in front of everyone she knew while having the most traumatic experience of her life. Dr. Raymond had given me the name of a psychiatrist who specialized in grief-induced psychosis, explaining that Lily was likely experiencing a condition where trauma and isolation had caused her to create an alternate reality where she wasn't alone. He said the wedding was probably Lily's subconscious way of trying to make this fantasy feel more real, to get external validation for a relationship that only existed in her mind. The psychiatrist, Dr. Opal Foster, had agreed to meet with me to discuss intervention options, and she'd been direct about the severity of Lily's condition. She explained that allowing the wedding to proceed would be catastrophic for Lily's mental health, that the trauma of standing at an altar with no groom would likely cause a complete breakdown requiring immediate hospitalization. Dr. Foster had outlined several intervention approaches, but all of them required me to be the one to stop the wedding, because I was Lily's closest family member and the person she trusted most. She said I needed to cancel everything before the actual day arrived, to create a controlled environment where Lily could be confronted with reality and immediately connected with professional help. The conversation had lasted 2 hours, and I'd left her office feeling like I was being asked to amputate my own daughter's leg to save her life, a necessary cruelty that would hurt both of us beyond measure. I'd spent the next 3 days researching facilities that could help Lily, speaking with intake coordinators at psychiatric hospitals that specialized in treating delusional disorders and psychotic breaks. Each conversation made the situation more real and more terrifying, understanding that my daughter was sick in a way I'd been refusing to acknowledge for years. One intake coordinator had asked me gently how long I'd known about Lily's condition, and when I admitted it had been at least 2 years, she'd gone quiet before saying that early intervention was crucial, and that waiting this long had probably made things significantly worse. 10 days before the wedding, I'd made the decision that was going to destroy my relationship with my daughter, but hopefully save her life. I started with the venue, calling Vanessa and explaining that we needed to cancel everything immediately. She'd been surprisingly understanding once I explained in vague terms that there was a family emergency, offering to refund most of the deposit except for the food they'd already ordered. Then I called the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band, the cake baker, methodically dismantling every piece of the wedding Lily had spent months planning. Each phone call felt like removing another brick from a structure my daughter had built to protect herself from unbearable loneliness. The hardest call was to Madison, Lily's best friend who'd been so excited about being maid of honor. I'd asked her to meet me for coffee and spent an hour explaining what was really happening, watching her face go through shock and disbelief and finally heartbroken understanding. Madison had admitted she'd noticed strange things about Lily's relationship with Ethan, like how he never appeared in person, and Lily always had excuses for why he couldn't make it to gatherings. But she'd convinced herself it was just a private relationship. Madison agreed to help me tell the other bridesmaids and to be there when I had to confront Lily with the truth. We'd coordinated with Dr. Foster to have the intervention at my house with the psychiatrist present, creating the safest possible environment for what was going to be a devastating conversation. I'd called Beverly and explained everything, and she'd driven up from 2 states away to be there for support. My sister had always been closer to Lily than I'd realized, and she'd admitted through tears that Lily had called her several times over the past year sounding confused and disoriented, talking about Ethan as if he was real and getting upset when Beverly gently questioned details that didn't make sense. Beverly blamed herself for not telling me sooner, for not pushing harder when she'd noticed Lily was struggling. The night before the intervention, I'd barely slept, running through everything I needed to say and dreading Lily's reaction when she realized what I'd done. Dr. Foster had coached me on how to approach the conversation, emphasizing that I needed to be direct but compassionate, clear about reality while acknowledging Lily's pain. The intervention was scheduled for a Friday morning, exactly 1 week before the wedding was supposed to happen. I'd invited Lily over for breakfast under the pretense of wanting to help with some last-minute wedding details, and she'd arrived cheerful and excited, carrying a binder full of checklists and timelines. Madison was already there along with Beverly and Dr. Foster, who I'd introduced as a family friend who specialized in helping people through difficult transitions. Lily had seemed slightly confused by the gathering, but had sat down at the kitchen table, accepting the coffee I poured and launching into updates about final preparations. She said Ethan had picked up his tuxedo the day before and it fit perfectly, that he was getting more nervous and excited as the date approached. I'd let her talk for a few minutes, watching her face glow with happiness while my heart shattered, and then I gently interrupted to say we needed to discuss something important. The shift in Lily's expression had been immediate, her smile fading as she looked around at all of us with growing suspicion. She'd asked what was going on, why everyone looked so serious, and I'd taken a deep breath before speaking the words that would change everything. I'd told her as gently as I could that there wasn't going to be a wedding because Ethan wasn't real, that he'd never been real, that she'd created him out of grief and loneliness after losing her father. Lily had gone completely still, staring at me like I'd spoken a language she didn't understand, and then she'd laughed nervously and said I was joking. This was some kind of weird prank. But when no one else laughed and I kept talking, explaining what I'd observed and what her neighbor had told me and what I'd found in her apartment, her face had drained of all color. She'd turned to Madison for support, but Madison had tears running down her face, confirming that she'd never actually met Ethan either, that all of Lily's friends had been worried but didn't know how to help. Lily had stood up abruptly, backing away from the table, saying we were all crazy, that Ethan was real, and they were getting married in 1 week. She'd pulled out her phone and started scrolling through photos, holding up images of herself alone, and insisting we were looking at pictures of both of them together. Dr. Foster had stepped in then, her voice calm and professional, explaining that Lily had been experiencing a break from reality triggered by trauma and isolation. The meltdown that followed was one of the worst things I'd ever witnessed. Lily had screamed that we were lying, that we were trying to ruin her happiness, that she'd just talked to Ethan that morning and he was real and loved her. She'd grabbed her binder and started reading off details about the wedding, the guest list, and the menu and the seating arrangements, as if proving how much planning had gone into it somehow proved Ethan existed. Madison had tried to hug her, but Lily had shoved her away, accusing all of us of conspiring against her for reasons she couldn't understand. When I'd told her I'd already canceled the venue and all the vendors, Lily had let out a sound I'd never heard before, somewhere between a wail and a gasp, and collapsed onto the kitchen floor. She'd curled into herself, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, repeating over and over that she couldn't do this. She couldn't lose someone else. Not again. I'd gotten down on the floor with her and held her while she cried, feeling her grip my arms so tight she left bruises. And through her tears, she'd begged me to tell her it wasn't true, to say Ethan was real and the wedding was still happening. Dr. Foster had explained to Lily that she needed immediate help, that what she was experiencing was a medical condition that required professional treatment. Lily had looked at the psychiatrist with such betrayal, realizing this wasn't just a family friend, but someone brought in specifically to evaluate her mental state. She'd asked me how long I'd been planning this, how long I'd known, and when I'd admitted it had been months, she'd called me a liar and a traitor for going along with the wedding plans while secretly thinking she was crazy. The accusation had hurt because it was true. I had been lying by omission, participating in her delusion because I was too afraid to confront it directly. Beverly had tried to explain that we were doing this out of love, that letting her stand at an altar waiting for someone who wouldn't appear would have been crueler than this intervention. But Lily wasn't hearing any of it. She was trapped in shock and grief, unable to process that the relationship she'd built her entire future around had never existed outside her own mind. Dr. Foster had eventually convinced Lily to come with her voluntarily to a treatment facility, explaining that she needed intensive therapy and possibly medication to help her brain process reality correctly again. The drive to the psychiatric hospital was silent, except for Lily's occasional sobs from the back seat where she sat between Madison and Beverly. I'd followed Dr. Foster's car, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, wondering if I'd just destroyed my daughter's trust forever by forcing her to face a truth she wasn't ready for. The facility was clean and modern, nothing like the terrifying asylums from movies. But Lily had resisted going inside until Dr. Foster explained that this was voluntary admission, and she could participate in her own treatment plan. The intake process took 3 hours, with multiple staff members evaluating Lily and asking her detailed questions about her relationship with Ethan, and when she'd first started experiencing what they called phantom relationship syndrome. Lily had answered their questions in a flat, defeated voice, occasionally glancing at me with an expression that mixed hurt and confusion, and something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding. When it was time for me to leave, Lily had grabbed my hand and asked in a small voice if I really believed Ethan wasn't real, if I truly thought she'd been imagining him all this time. I told her the truth, that I knew she'd been in so much pain after losing her father that her mind had created someone to help her cope, but that person wasn't real no matter how much she wished he was. The first 2 weeks of Lily's treatment were the hardest of my life. I'd gone home to an empty house filled with wedding decorations Lily had stored in my garage, boxes of favors and centerpieces, and place cards that would never be used. I'd spent an entire day calling everyone on the guest list to cancel, offering vague explanations about a family emergency, and asking them not to contact Lily directly. Some people were understanding, others demanded more details, and a few had clearly heard rumors and asked pointed questions about Lily's mental health that I'd refused to answer. Madison had been incredible through all of it, helping me return rented items and cancel final payments, fielding questions from concerned friends who wanted to know what happened. She'd visited Lily twice during those first weeks and reported that Lily was angry and confused, but starting to participate in therapy sessions. The treatment team had diagnosed Lily with complicated grief disorder that had evolved into a delusional disorder, explaining that Richard's sudden death had triggered a psychological break that manifested as creating an imaginary romantic partner. Dr. Foster had called me for weekly updates on Lily's progress, explaining that they were using a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and medication to help Lily distinguish between reality and the fantasy she'd constructed. She said Lily was resistant at first, insisting Ethan was real and demanding to call him, but when staff members asked her to provide any verifiable information about him, like a phone number or workplace or family members they could contact, she'd been unable to produce anything concrete. The breakthrough had come during the 3rd week when Lily's therapist asked her to describe how she and Ethan had met, and Lily had started telling the story only to realize midway through that she couldn't actually remember the meeting because it had never happened. She'd created the memory after the fact, building a backstory to support the relationship she'd invented. That realization had been devastating but also necessary, the first crack in the delusion that allowed reality to seep through. Lily had cried for hours afterward, grieving the loss of Ethan as if he'd died even though he'd never lived, and her therapist had explained that this grief was valid and important to process. By the 4th week, I was finally allowed to visit Lily at the facility. She'd looked different somehow, smaller and more fragile, wearing comfortable clothes instead of the stylish outfits she usually preferred. We'd sat in a visiting room with large windows overlooking a garden, and for a long time neither of us spoke. Finally, Lily had asked me if I remembered when she'd first mentioned Ethan, and I'd told her it was about 2 years ago, maybe 6 months after Richard died. She'd nodded and said her therapist thought that was significant, that she'd created Ethan shortly after losing her father as a way to fill the void of male support and protection in her life. Lily had admitted she still sometimes felt like Ethan was real, that her brain would insist he was just in another room or about to call, and it took constant effort to remind herself he'd never existed. She'd asked me why I hadn't stopped her sooner, why I'd let her plan an entire wedding to someone imaginary, and I'd had no good answer except that I'd been terrified of losing her completely if I forced her to face the truth. Lily had understood but said it hurt knowing I'd watched her deteriorate for so long without intervening earlier. The wedding day arrived with strange normalcy, just another Saturday that should have been the most important day of Lily's life. Instead, she was in a therapy session at the psychiatric facility, working through the complicated grief of mourning a relationship that had never existed, while simultaneously grieving the father who'd actually died. I'd spent the day alone at home, looking through old photo albums of Lily growing up, remembering the bright, happy child she'd been before tragedy and loneliness had broken something inside her. Beverly had called to check on me and suggested we do something to mark the day, to acknowledge what Lily had lost, even if it wasn't real in the way she'd believed. We'd ended up going to Richard's grave and leaving flowers, talking to him about Lily and asking him somehow to help her heal. It had felt silly and superstitious, but also necessary, a way of including him in the process of helping our daughter recover from losing him. On the drive home, Beverly had mentioned that she'd done some research on phantom relationship syndrome and found it was more common than people realized, especially among people who'd experienced sudden traumatic loss. She said there were support groups for family members dealing with loved ones in similar situations. Lily's treatment lasted 6 weeks total before the doctors felt she was stable enough for outpatient care. I'd picked her up on a Wednesday afternoon and driven her back to her apartment, which she'd asked me to clear of all Ethan-related items before her return. Madison and I had spent 2 days removing the men's clothes from her closet, taking down the photoshopped pictures, disposing of the love letters and wedding planning materials. We'd redecorated slightly, making the space feel fresh and new, somewhere Lily could start rebuilding her life based on reality. When Lily walked in and saw the changes, she'd stood in the doorway for a long time before saying thank you, that seeing all those reminders would have made recovery impossible. She'd started intensive outpatient therapy 3 times a week, plus a support group for people recovering from delusional disorders. The first few months were incredibly difficult, with Lily experiencing frequent episodes where she'd forget Ethan wasn't real and have to go through the grief of losing him all over again. Her therapist explained this was normal, that the brain needed time to rewire itself and accept a reality that contradicted years of false memories and experiences. 6 months after the canceled wedding, Lily and I were finally able to have an honest conversation about everything that had happened. She'd invited me to her apartment for dinner, the first meal she'd cooked for anyone since leaving the facility, and we'd sat at her small kitchen table eating pasta while carefully navigating difficult topics. Lily had admitted that part of her would always miss Ethan, even though she now understood intellectually that he'd never been real. She said the loneliness that had created him was still there, a constant ache she was learning to manage through therapy and medication, and slowly rebuilding her social connections. She'd asked me if I regretted canceling the wedding or if I ever wondered whether I should have let her have that day even if it ended in disaster. I told her honestly that I'd made the only choice I could live with, that watching her stand at an altar alone would have destroyed us both, and this way at least she'd had a chance to get help before hitting rock bottom publicly. Lily had reached across the table and taken my hand, saying she understood now why I'd done it, even though at the time she'd hated me for it. She said I'd saved her life by being willing to be the villain in her story. The question of how this happened still haunted both of us. Lily's psychiatrist had explained during family therapy sessions that phantom relationships usually developed in people with certain risk factors, including sudden traumatic loss, social isolation, and pre-existing tendencies toward maladaptive coping mechanisms. Richard's death had been unexpected and devastating, and Lily had been living alone in a new city without strong social connections when it happened. Her therapist from that time had apparently noted concerns about Lily's isolation and suggested she join social groups or try online dating, but Lily had stopped going to therapy before implementing any of those suggestions. Instead, she'd retreated further into herself, working long hours at her marketing job and spending evenings alone in her apartment. At some point during those lonely months, her brain had started filling the void with someone who understood her perfectly, who was always available, who could never leave or die or disappoint her. Ethan had started as almost an imaginary friend, someone she'd talk to in her head when feeling overwhelmed, but gradually he'd become more real until she couldn't distinguish between imagination and reality anymore. Understanding the mechanics of how it happened didn't make it less tragic or strange. Lily attended her support group religiously and found comfort in connecting with others who'd experienced similar breaks from reality. She'd made friends with a woman named Claire who'd created an entire imaginary family after losing her parents and siblings in a car accident, living for 3 years with phantom husband and children before someone intervened. Claire and Lily had bonded over the unique grief of mourning people who'd never existed, the shame and confusion of realizing your brain had been lying to you so convincingly. The support group leader, a therapist named Dr. Walsh, had explained that the human need for connection was so powerful that sometimes brains would create it synthetically when real connection wasn't available. He compared it to how desert travelers sometimes saw mirages of water, the mind producing what it desperately needed even when that thing wasn't actually there. The comparison had helped Lily feel less crazy and more human, understanding that her brain had been trying to protect her in its own dysfunctional way. A year after the canceled wedding, Lily had progressed enough in her recovery to move to a new apartment in a building with more social amenities. She'd made friends with neighbors, joined a book club, and started volunteering at an animal shelter on weekends. The structure and real human connection were helping her stay grounded in reality, giving her genuine relationships to replace the phantom ones she'd lost. She'd even started dating someone real, a cautious beginning with a man named Oliver, who worked at the shelter and knew about her history because Lily had been honest about her mental health struggles. Oliver had been understanding and patient, taking things slowly and checking in regularly about how Lily was feeling. Watching them together made me nervous because I was terrified something would trigger a relapse, but Lily's therapist had assured me that she was doing the work necessary to maintain her grip on reality. The relationship with Oliver was different from the one with Ethan, Lily explained, because it required compromise and had normal relationship problems, instead of the perfect fantasy she'd created in her mind. Looking back now, I still believe canceling that wedding was the right choice, even though it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Lily's recovery has been long and painful, full of setbacks and difficult realizations about how sick she'd been and how much time she'd lost to a delusion. But she's building a real life now, one based on actual experiences and genuine connections instead of elaborate fantasies. She still has days when the loneliness feels overwhelming and she misses the comfort of Ethan's phantom presence, but she's learned healthier ways to cope with those feelings. We're closer now than we were before everything happened. Our relationship built on honesty and mutual understanding of how fragile mental health can be. Lily has forgiven me for the intervention and even thanked me for caring enough to destroy something she'd built when it became clear that creation was destroying her. She works now as an advocate for people with delusional disorders, sharing her story in the hope it helps others recognize when grief has crossed the line into something more dangerous. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.